Good afternoon. What I want to share with you today is in part based on my experience prior to working at Massey University, but in my former life as the operations manager of the National Maritime Coordination Centre based at the Joint Force headquarters in New Zealand. The National Maritime Coordination Centre is a multi-agency collaboration where civilian and defence agencies work together for the purposes of civilian maritime patrol, for sharing information and contributing to the maritime domain awareness of what is the fourth biggest EEZ in the world. So we take a whole-of-government approach to what we do, and the whole-of-government approach does present as a logical and pragmatic solution to delivering better public services. And in my experience, working with my peers across the whole of the sector, it is very unusual for us not to willingly engage with each other for better outcomes. But I think most of us would nod and say it's not impossible, but it is actually hard to do in practice. And based on my years at the NMCC, I was very keen to undertake some more research to understand why this is the case. So I decided to look at the governance frameworks, the language that we do, under which we work within the NMCC. So what I want to propose to you today is that the whole of government language that we use to govern our interagency practice actually helps to compound the autonomy accountability dilemma. We talked a little bit about autonomy this morning. In fact, Lieutenant Colonel Childs mentioned accountability. But what I mean by this dilemma is the tension between achieving the goals of working horizontally across the public sector in a whole of government environment and the needs of our respective individual organisational goals. And often this is inherent in the tension that individual actors experience when they're operating with their fellows from other agencies. So what I'm going to discuss with you today is the inherent tensions that a lot of us experience, and I'm going to propose to you that these tensions have come about due to the whole of government reform processes of the public sector. And I'm going to share with you the findings of the case study, which is the analysis of the NMCC governance frameworks over time, and propose that the language that's used actually helps to create confusion for those involved in interagency work, particularly at its coalface, and that there is a need to understand how the language that we use tends to affect the interactions for those involved, not just how we actually construct the language, but also how the wider institutional structure, whether it's our organisations or the broader public sector, actually impacts the way in which we use this language. And again, to go back to Colonel Michael Lewis, his quote, "Do we actually understand the problem in hand? Are we aware that we are actually repeating the same language over time and therefore impacting the way in which we work together?" So finally, I'm going to be a bit more positive and propose, in this case, what we can do to make some positive change. But first of all, the National Maritime Coordination Centre was established in 2001 in response to the Maritime Review, but this date is also quite key because it's the same date in which the incoming Labour government commissioned the review of the centre. And this was in response to the government's concerns over a very fragmented public sector that had been one of the unintended consequences, one could argue, of the earlier 80s reforms that actually brought about the much needed accountability of the public sector and the services that it delivered. But much research has gone into the impact of the later whole of government reforms, or in other countries, joined up government reforms that have created paradoxes for those of us who are engaged in the whole of government multi-agency space. And it's not just here in New Zealand, but also countries such as the UK, US, Canada, and Australia that have reported similar research. So for those of us engaged in interagency collaboration, those paradoxes for our managerial autonomy create in our ability to make decision-making power and the ability for us to have the autonomy, which is often compounded by the additional layers of control that these later reforms have brought about. So applied to the case study, the 2010 Officer of the Auditor General conducted a report of the effectiveness of the National Maritime Coordination Centre. And one of the things that it actually recommended was that there was need for greater strategic guidance over civilian maritime patrol requirements. So accordingly, in 2013, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, one of our three central agencies, created a Maritime Security Oversight Committee, which also included oversight of the NMCC. But just to show you how those additional layers of control tend to work as we review the lessons that we learned and we review where we may have been going wrong, here we see the 2006 governance framework for the National Maritime Coordination Centre. It's hosted within the New Zealand Customs Service, and you can see that vertical accountability to the Minister of Customs and the oversight provided by ODESC, which is part of, or ODESP as it was, is part of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and a reference group of CEs and then a working group. And you can see its relationship with defence. Now, moving forward after the 2010 recommendations, what we actually see is, if we go beyond the words within that particular framework, where the red circle indicates there is effectively that nothing really remains changed for the National Maritime Coordination Centre in terms of its governance. But what we do see is additional layers, additional lines of oversight, but the accountability still remains the same. So in effect, we can place the 2006 governance framework within the 2013 governance framework. So the paradox of autonomy tends to present in the fact that the vertical accountability has remained the same, and the Customs is still responsible for the performance of the NMCC. In fact, in 2015, if you look at the Select Committee transcripts, you can see that the CE of Customs was hauled over the coals for the fact that there were IPVs still docked alongside in Devonport. We don't own those IPVs. So this becomes problematic, especially when other agencies also have to achieve their own organisational goals. So the 2010 report of the Auditor General and later the 2014 report indicated there were still separate patrol arrangements ongoing, which wasn't in the whole of government good. And those were between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and Defence and between New Zealand Defence Force and Defence, despite the 2013 terms of reference being constructed. So to understand why we had these paradoxes, for those of us who are trying to achieve our best in the whole of government space, I actually looked at the language that was being used in the governance frameworks from 2006 and 2013. And what I found was there were two narratives in the language. The first was that of whole of government, which we would expect and associate with the later 2001 reforms. But there was another narrative in there that had a more powerful narrative, and that was of individual agency accountability and reporting practices, perhaps something we would associate with the earlier reforms of the late 80s. And indeed, the text afforded a greater affinity to individual agency practice, the result of which these confusing narratives meant for those of us involved in the coalface, we didn't actually know what our role was, because the language, the grammar that was being used was had a high degree of what we call normalization, or should I say a lack of active verbs. So it actually created a grey space for those of us who were actually involved in the day-to-day. The language also meant that a lot of the agencies involved didn't know where they fitted into the future of the NMCC. For example, what about the future patrol strategy? Or what about the future policies around the National Maritime Coordination Centre? There wasn't much guidance in that. So looking at the language between the frameworks over time and looking at the structures, we can see that, yes, there's a few new committees that have been created, a few new lines here and there, but really nothing has actually changed. And this, I argued, compounded the autonomy accountability dilemma for those of us who are actually engaged in practice. And this evidence, this finding is evidence of Matthew Flinder's observations that the later 2001 reform measures do not substitute the old structures but merely impose new layers. And specific to New Zealand, this is another example of Robert Gregory's critique of the 2001 review of the Centre, which he advocated significant changes to the state sector. But Gregory explains that the recommendations do not match the original 1980s reform's theoretical underpinnings with any serious contra-theory. In his words, the review of the Centre was a superficial response to fundamental problems. And he argues that the theoretical framework that laid the foundations for the conceptual blueprint of the earlier 80s reforms remains an enduring ideological force. And I argue because of this, we are not actually aware of the competing narratives that we sometimes have in place over the governance frameworks that oversee the work in which we do. We are often unaware of the language that we use, and to the extent that it's become naturalized. So in this case, the narrative of individual organization accountability and reporting predominates, and this hampers our ability to act with collaborative autonomy. To quote Matthew Flinders, he says that ministerial responsibility to Parliament was never designed to cope with multi-organisational fragmented policy systems, and therefore traditional modes of accountability may need to change to accommodate the future needs of managing the wicked problems of society. So finally, I argue what we could potentially do is look at using the 2013 amendments to the 1989 Public Finance Act. And one of those amendments is the multi-category appropriation, which is designed to replace the existing multi-category output expenses appropriation. But effectively, what it means is that we still have a single minister, we still have a single CE who manages the outcomes for a particular initiative, but everybody is accountable. That is, all departments at the end of the year reporting are also responsible for that multi-category appropriation. What I argue this helps to do is to make us all equally accountable, and therefore the autonomy accountability dilemma becomes an equal equation, and we all have the same degree of autonomy because we all have the same degree of accountability. And I argue that such an agreement would make a structural reality of the later governance framework aspiration to lead the development of an effective performance measurement framework for all of government maritime security, including accountability for the analysis of the overall performance of the system, as well as meeting the recommendations of the Officer of the Auditor General. So I've very briefly talked about the unintended consequences of the reforms and how it impacts the language that we use to construct the governance over interagency collaboration. And whilst this is just one case study, I do argue this offers a different lens through which we can look at these issues and maybe raises some wider questions. But indeed, it is very fundamental that we understand the language that we use, and if we are repeating the same language, and if we have an armed, more fuller, in-depth understanding of what we are saying, then perhaps we know what the real problem is, and we are empowered to make real change. Thank you.